This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is New York Times bestselling author, historian, and journalist Colin Woodard. His latest book is Nations Apart: How Clashing Regional Cultures Shattered America, which we'll be talking about today. Colin Woodard, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
I thought we'd start kind of at the very beginning because you argue that the United States isn't really one nation, but actually sort of a federation of cultures. And so for people who aren't familiar with your previous work where you kind of started to develop this, what do you mean by American nations?
Yeah, that comes from the title of a book in 2011 I wrote that kind of laid out this way of understanding American history. And it's that to try to understand the United States as being a single nation state with a single American culture is impossible. It's why we have such difficulty, interpreting our history and understanding the regional divides and why are there red states and blue states? Why does ideology map to geography? That doesn't necessarily make any sense. But if you realize that we're really a federation of, think of them as stateless nations, each with their own cultural background and original intents and ideologies and political characteristics and religious traditions, everything makes a great deal more sense. And indeed, the reason we're this way boils down to the fact that the rival, European colonization projects, the Puritans in New England, the Dutch originally around what's now New York City, the William Penn's Quaker utopia that started in Delaware Bay around Philly, the Tidewater gentry, the lesser sons of the big English country aristocratic families, the ones who weren't going to get the estate at home, trying to create a manorial, manor home, Lord Grantham, Downton Abbey kind of world in the Virginia wilderness around the Chesapeake, the deep Southern project, which was English slave lords from Barbados, like a fully formed West Indies slave society. They ran out of room in their islands by the 1670s and came to Charleston and founded what became the sort of deep or cotton South. The people from the war-ravaged borderlands of Britain, English marches, the lowlands of Scotland, where Braveheart were from, and especially Ulster, where Queen Elizabeth and James I sent lowland Scots to conquer the Irish. These were a warrior people living in a place with very few institutions where you had to protect your kith and kin yourself, and no good could come of government or the armies. And the Spanish moving south to north in the Southwest and so on. These were all completely different societies who never had even the slightest inkling that they would belong to a single country together. And that happened as an accident of history in the 1770s, when a change in British imperial policy was threatening to force all of these idiosyncratic societies to conform to the will of the crown. It was going to destroy the whole political and social ways each one was structured. So they gathered together in a sort of rebel alliance to protect each of their own systems. And miraculously, they won. And then they were in something called the United States together. And that's why our country is so complex and confounding and has a hard time finding broad consensus.
Right.
And even if it's necessary that we do.
Now, there's something from Zelinsky called the doctrine of first effective settlement that really plays an important role in your work. And can you kind of explain what that is and how it fits in here?
Correct. That's sort of the academic foundations of I call it the American nations model, if you'd like, is Wilbur Zelinsky he's a late cultural geographer. He was asking in the 1970s, a kind of big question, cultural geography, how do cultures get started? Anthropologists and sociologists have traced how cultures transmit themselves over time, cultural transmission from individual to individual in schools and churches and, the rituals of who we're supposed to be and the holidays we follow and the songs we sing, transfers cultural information that's sort of, out there as almost a community over time. But he was wondering, how does a culture get started? If a bunch of humans arrive somewhere where there were no humans, or if they, wipe out the people who were there, how does a new culture get started? And his theory, which I think is correct, was that the first group of settlers who are able to create kind of a self-sustaining society that carries on will have an outsized influence on the future trajectory and characteristics of that society, even if their numbers were very small and the numbers the rest of us who came later were enormous. They sort of format the hard drive, if you will, the assumptions and institutions and all those things that get transmitted as culture. The rest of us can come and, adapt and, adapt to it or change it at the margins, but it's there and it has lasting power, which you can demonstrate. And this isn't just, in the United States, but anywhere in the world. It's just ours is a little simpler to understand because, we had one massive colonization project and here we are. Whereas if you traced it in Europe, when did the, Celts conquer the whatever people and then this empire came and that. So you need like 20 overlays to understand it. But here, the resonance and the signal is really, really obvious. So American Nations is basically mapping the first effective settler cultures, starting with those colonial clusters I described, those rival colonial projects. But each of them, and this is kind of the amazing part, had pretty much mutually exclusive settlement zones, most of them going east to west into the continent, the Spanish project going south to north, and where they avoided one another. They largely all the way out well beyond the Mississippi through the 80s, each one, the descendants of each of these projects bringing these assumptions was able to keep formatting the cultural hard drive. And they did not follow state boundaries or even international boundaries. Often those boundaries didn't exist yet. So you have to look at it at a county level to understand it. People argue about, is is Pennsylvania, why, what are the differences in Pennsylvania and why? Ohio, why is the Western Reserve of Connecticut around Cleveland so different from the southern part, founded as, the old Virginia military district around Cincinnati? Why do the three parts of California not get along? How about, Texas? Like everyone in Texas knows Austin's the capital, but that Dallas and Houston and San Antonio are the hubs of three very different Texases, and so on. That, once you understand the settlement geography, it clicks and you can actually map it. And the stunning thing that came out of American Nations and the new book really digs into is at a county level, you can still see across all kinds of phenomena in American life, you can still see those settlement zones. They're like giant tectonic fissures in our politics and society.
I think it's really amazing because, we've had centuries of migration. We have this sort of nationalized media, nationalized economy, in many ways a nationalized culture. And yet it really gives a sense of how strong that sort of first mover sort of, you said, formatting the hard drive thing really is, because you would expect that most of that would have been wiped out by now. But not so much.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems almost ridiculous that these centuries-old traces, sometimes with very small settlement groups, could survive given all the things you said. We have mass retailing, mass media, mass culture, mass migration. We move around. We're born in one part of the country and, half of us, move from one place to another. How could you possibly still see the signal? But indeed, across almost any phenomena you look at, you do. And not only do you, the signals are getting stronger. So the question becomes, why is that and how can it be? The power of culture, but also there are a number of things, the intrinsic qualities of these rival cultures have a power of their own to, say, attract or repel immigrants or certain kinds of immigrants. And so the movement of people today, a lot of social scientists have asked, well, why is it that of all these people moving from blue states or moving to red states, why aren't the red states getting more purple? Instead, they're getting more red. What they discovered was, by and large, in aggregate, the people who move resemble politically or whatever you look at the destination, not their point of origin. In other words, people are statistically voting with their feet. If you're frustrated with the place you were born, because, there's a as individuals, we have a wide range of opinions. It's just what's the dominant culture look like around you? And if you were, born, raised, moved to as a kid or whatever in a culture where you feel like everyone around you has all these unexamined assumptions that are completely wrong and it frustrates you. And if you ever had your choice and your company was going to let you relocate, you'd move to somewhere where people believe A and B, not X and Y. And by and large, people are doing exactly that. They're trying to move to be among their own people. And because of the maldistribution culturally of these different assumptions, that often means they're moving between regional cultures. In other words, the map is being cleaned up, probably unfortunately for our stability, where the dominant cultural mores are getting reinforced, not diluted by the migration movements.
One of the distinctions you made that I thought was fairly important, really important politically, is the distinction between communitarian and individualistic cultures. And you also further make a distinction between aggressively and passively communitarian and individualistic. Could you talk a little bit about that and why it matters?
Yeah. So after American Nations, I did another book pretty much on exactly this called American Character. It came out in early 2016. It said, look, we have these regional cultures. What do we do about it? What have they been fighting over? And is there a way that you could reach a federal consensus so that we could, kind of a supermajority that could govern in federal politics? There were decades where there were regional coalitions that gave us a supermajority that sometimes, regardless of which party was in power, generally were moving the same direction. The laissez-faire era of the late 19th century, the Greater New Deal era, which isn't just FDR, it's Truman and Eisenhower, often with Republican majorities, JFK, LBJ. That's multiple iterations of who's in control of Congress and the presidency. And yet the general idea that you were going to invest in infrastructure and institutions and space programs and all of that was agreed upon. High tax rates on the richest people and, a sort of more equitable distribution of income, totally different from the laissez-faire period. But for the past, generation and a half, every election's on a knife's edge. They're all won by, tiny margins, whether it's the presidency or the House or the Senate. Every once in a while, one party gets a big counter victory and everyone declares the other party dead forever. And then the other party wins the next. We are not living in stable times, and it's made dealing with the nation's problems nigh impossible because our constitutional, arrangements allow checks that make it impossible to do big things like constitutional amendments or whatever. So, that's the broader background problem of that. So the thing you asked is, well, what are they divided over? And in the end, up until 2016 anyway, our whole federal politics has been dominated by an argument about how you achieve the American experiment in representative self-government, right? And the Declaration of Independence is like our mission statement that says, hey, we're a people dedicated to try to make a society where basically people can be maximally and sustainably free over time. In other words, a few families don't become super free and maximize their freedom by taking it away from everyone else, and you end up in an aristocracy. So how do you do that? And the argument has been between cultures that champion, and individuals, but there are dominant cultures that champion individual liberty, like Greater Appalachia, that the way to achieve freedom and maximize freedom would be to maximize the freedom of each individual. That if, there's less taxes, less regulation, less government, that axiomatically that means each of us must be more free. And then there's a counter tradition that I call communitarian. It's about, be free. You have to maintain the common good. You have to build and keep doing the maintenance on the complex infrastructure, civilizational infrastructure that makes it possible for individual humans to even contemplate all being free. That it's, you have to maintain the leveling mechanisms intergenerationally so that each person, regardless of the circumstances of their birth, has a shot at the American experiment of pursuing their happiness. Of being able to not be tyrannized. And to do that, you need, these days, libraries and schools and clinics and highways and, broadband access in rural areas and all kinds of stuff. In other words, it's a social project, the cultivation of a Republican citizenry. And those have opposite political implications, right? One might be sort of New Dealish, let's build the interstate and send man to the moon. And the other one is like, no, we should have no taxes and no government at all and each fend for ourselves and then we'll be more free. And so that's the battle. In the work we've been doing that you can read about in the new book, Nations Apart, that was, I set up about 2.5 years ago at a university, a whole little research center that uses this work and studies with data all kinds of things in American life to understand it better and hopefully develop tools to hold us together, have better policy and such. And that's where we develop the sort of, there are two categories of being aggressively communitarian, like the greater New England cultural space, or the culture that's on the Pacific coastal plains between the Pacific and the mountains from about Monterey, Massachusetts through Juneau, Alaska. They all agree with one another, San Francisco, Monterey, Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, and disagree with the interiors of their own states and provinces on everything.
Yeah.
They're set against more individualistic cultures. You have aggressively individualistic ones like the Deep South and legacy Tidewater Chesapeake zone, and certainly Greater Appalachia, where for different cultural reasons, you see it imperative to have weak government and weak institutions and maximum autonomy and movement for the individual, even if it results in inequalities. And in between are ones that are sort of passively communitarian, passively individualistic. They lean one way or the other, but aren't quite as strident in it. Places like the Midlands, which started with William Penn's experiments in Philadelphia and the Delaware Bay, but then moved in a sort of strip across the middle part of the Midwest, the middle part of Pennsylvania and Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and St. Louis and parts of Missouri, with the Yankees, strongly communitarian, people who believe originally that they were on a mission from God, right? A covenanted relationship like the Old Testament Hebrews. God had told the early Puritans in the 1630s that they were the chosen people to do big things in the world, and they had to do them as a group, and they would be punished or rewarded as a group for how they did them. And they got together, like worried Calvinists, and did it through shared institutions, town governments, and all kinds of arrangements. But the whole point was the mission of the community was what mattered. If the individual got in the way through selfishness or not following the rules, you came down hard on them, right? Individual liberty was not considered the key to building a successful community. You have that on one side of the Midlanders, and on the other side of the Midlanders, you have the greater Appalachian people who are like, all institutions can't be trusted. There's, got to trust your kith and kin and people personally to be trustworthy. Everybody else, has to know that you're, fierce and not mess with your stuff. And that gives you a geography that you can recognize in elections, in, say, how people responded to public health advice or advice to get vaccinated during the COVID-19 pandemic, about gun violence and attitudes towards whether it's most important to protect the rights of the gun owner or the safety of the community. They all fall on these lines over and over again. So it's a powerful way of understanding the difference between the political cultures, but it's a meta issue where the cultures have very strong and centuries-old stances on those issues that affect our politics and create the red state, blue state map.
It reminds me when you were talking about the New England area, that Yankeedom region that you talk about in the books, and say, well, they're very communitarian, but there's also a very high focus on what you call punitive control. And it made me think about what a conservative writer I like a lot, Jonah Goldberg, sometimes calls liberal fascism. This idea that, and it sounds like it tracks exactly with what you're saying, is that for the good of the collective, sometimes we need to kind of down sort of hard in cases on individual liberties for that kind of communal good.
Yeah, and what the argument in American Character is, okay, like if you run in either of those directions to the extreme, to extreme individualism where there's like no state and no actors and no counter mechanisms, or extreme communitarianism where individuals, are distrusted entirely and you have faith into some, abstract institutional models, they both end in tyranny. One, you end up in an oligarchy like, Guatemala before the drug lords took over because, the state, everything got so weak they could just step in, like with the 10 families and capitalized, run everything, or Honduras. Or in the other extreme, you end up with, Orwell and Stalin and, the Nazis. They're both bad. But logically, if either extreme leads to tyranny, where is that point where you're maximally free, where you're having a liberal democracy, small L, small d, like, the libertarian rights, of the individual are protected, and you have a free society. Theoretically, there must be a balance point between those two essential aspects of freedom, where in equilibrium, you're optimizing the balance. And the trick is, how do you find that middle ground to optimize and balance it? And that was kind of the argument in American Character, was knowing these regional cultures and their history, where does that optimal ground lie? It does argue that, we have been increasingly going down into an extreme on the individualism scale that has created these mass differences in wealth and power and legal repercussions if, you break a crime, and all kinds of things that are undermining the whole social contract, and that we need to move the other direction. But you can go too far in either direction. What you point out with the Yankees, the early Puritans, is absolutely true. I mean, think about the events and the culture that led Hawthorne to write the Scarlet Letter, right? Putting people into the stock, the intolerance and coming down upon individual idiosyncrasies that was, tarnished the Puritans' reputation, rightly so. You don't want to go down that path that far, right? But you can also go so individualistic that, there's total chaos, and, the one warlord who's, maximized his freedom, he and his family, shoot you and take your stuff, and because there's no one to stop them. So you don't want that either.
The Lincoln Wishlist sales event is happening now. Here's what's on everyone's wish list. Enjoying holiday jingles with brilliant 3D audio that surrounds you? Check. Watching snow flurries through the panoramic Vista roof? Check. Packing up presents with the spacious Lincoln Splitgate? Check. Everything you want. All standard on the 2025 Lincoln Navigator SUV. Visit your local Lincoln retailer or learn more at Lincoln.com for exceptional offers on 2025 Lincoln vehicles today.
Hey there, it's Dr. Sanjay Gupta with some exciting news to share. CNN is now streaming. That means you can read, watch, and stream everything in one subscription. You can watch news live 24/7. You can also explore catch-up videos and explainer videos, and you can also watch a library of CNN's originals, including my latest documentary, It Doesn't Have to Hurt. Just go to cnn.com/all-access.
I feel like this is super important for a lot of reasons, but one that occurs to me is in how we try to talk to each other, because it seems to me that city on a hill language is going to work for some people, but give me freedom or give me death language is going to work better for other people. But unless you can really understand sort of the vernacular that they come from, it's going to be really difficult to connect with them if that culture is just so fundamentally different.
Yeah. And a lot of the importance of understanding this regional landscape and its implications is exactly that. If you don't understand what's dividing people, you can't even get to actually having a functional conversation to find the meeting point that people can live with. And we need to find the meeting point, or you end up, having your whole democracy collapse, which people are now experiencing very quickly. This is the result of allowing these forces to fester and corrode to the point where we weren't able to solve things. So, how do you do that? How do you communicate across those things? Well, for most dominant regional cultures, I will name names and say that the Deep South's, received culture is against the Declaration. All of its intellectuals back in the antebellum period, Civil War, and so on argued that no, humans are not inherently equal and aren't meant to be free. Only the blah, blah, blah people are, originally the Anglo-Saxon race, right? And that was an argument, an ethno-national and authoritarian model. The deep Southern intellectuals and political leaders were arguing that you should enslave, the working class white people as well for their own good, that you should create a society like the classical republics of ancient Greece and Rome, which were slave societies, where a tiny minority had at the top of the pyramid had the privilege or liberty to practice democracy, and subjugation and slavery were the natural lot of the many. That's the republic that they wanted to create. But for all the other regional cultures nowadays anyway, including Greater Appalachia and certainly the Far West, the argument is about, how do you create a free society? And one thing that my project worked on, Nationhood Lab is the name of the project, that's unpacked in the book, Nations Apart, is that there's a shared, the question we had was, how do you hold this country together? Do we have anything in common across the regions? And the answer is yes. That most people, we did tons of polling on this and qualitative interviews, and we just dug into it. The vast majority of Americans believe not in that ethno-nationalist, blood and soil definition that there's a certain tribe of people who are the real Americans and everyone else is here provisionally. No, most Americans agree that we're a people who have a shared set of ideals that were set forth in the Declaration of Independence and our mission statement as a people. And that is that we are a people devoted to trying to create a society where those ideals are possible, those natural rights that every human was given by God or the universe. It was intended to not be tyrannized, to survive, to pursue happiness as they understand it, and to have access to the representative self-government that makes it possible. And we put side by side in the nicest language possible, we put statement pairs. We ask people, do you think America's purpose is this or that? And this was based on the Declaration's ideals, and that was based on something very similar to the speech that he hadn't given it yet, but very similar to J.D. Vance's speech to the Claremont Institute when he argued we're not just an ideal, we're a people, right? That in the end, it's about shared heritage and lineage and tradition and like intrinsic qualities, character that belong to a particular peoples, right? That the implication in that is that it's peoples who had to have been around here for a long time. In J.D. Vance's example, he was talking about, essentially the real Americans are those who colonized the frontier and took the continent from the indigenous people. But that was something that was completed by the mid-1880s. So you're leaving out the indigenous people who were brought here as slaves and therefore weren't participating in that project. And everybody whose immigrant parents came, in the 1880 to 1924 immigration wave, the Catholic, Orthodox Christian, Jewish wave, and people from East Asia to the West Coast, and everyone who's come since, right? It's excluding, a large, I've got people in my genome who would make it under J.D. Vance's definition, but a lot of my great-grandparents wouldn't. They're not as American. So we put those statement pairs side by side. And I thought that the heritage, lineage one would actually win with most people because it just seemed more concrete, whereas the ideals and declaration seem so airy and abstract and fartsy, right? But no, it was like basically 60-30, in favor of the civic, even when you placed them side by side. And that was true across, gender, generation, regional cultures, education levels, are you essentially, rich, poor, high school education, college education. And the only groups that weren't pretty much a supermajority were Republicans and people who said they voted for Trump in 2020. But in those cases, too, 45% of them preferred the civic values. Yeah. For a country that's divided, that was pretty impressive. And then we put out in another poll, we were like, well, let's just ask people rather than X or Y, let's just ask them straight out, do you agree that as Americans, we are duty-bound and tasked to protect one another's rights to, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness? And I thought, maybe it'll be 60-40 again. It was 97-2. I mean, absolutely bonkers. You never see an answer that is 97-2. Our pollsters had never seen an answer to any question with that gap. If you ask Americans, and the Pew Charitable Trust did, is the earth round or flat? The answer is 80-10, with 10% undecided. So, I mean, what I'm saying is it is baked in that is actually the purpose of the country. And if you get people into that mode, like, oh yeah, I agree with that, and this person over here who I disagree with on everything agrees with that, well, you can start having a productive discussion. Does policy X that's being introduced or action Y by the president or whoever, does that further or pull back on the quest to achieve those things?
Right.
And, that's a fruitful discussion. And if it is destructive of it, maybe that should give you second thoughts. If it's helping it, well, maybe you're on board. And, that should be the North Star, the Polaris of how all of us and all of our elected representatives think about what to do next, because we do kind of broadly agree on that. So that's like a really powerful element and tool of our work, because, liberal democracies, small L, small d, of Western democracies, society, this kind of society, this is a whole new thing in human history. We were around for 5,000 years of complex civilization, and it was all despotisms until like 300 or 400 years ago, with a mere idea that you might try to have individuals be free. Not just the aristocracy, but everybody. And we're not very good at it, but it's a fragile thing. And, the default would be to go back to despotism, and that's not going to be good for 90% of us. So maybe we should not do that.
Yeah, it is very heartening to know the strong degree of agreement on those fundamental things. Granted, it can be a lot easier to agree on broad concepts, and then when you try to implement them, that can be pretty tricky. But still, that amount of agreement blows me away, and I think a lot of should a lot of people. And, it occurred to me when you were talking about Vice President Vance, I wonder how much of his remarks have to do with his cultural regional upbringing. I associate Appalachia with being very insular, very suspicious of outside authority, that sort of thing. But weirdly, and maybe not weirdly, I think, in a way, it also seems to be a huge Trump area. So even though they're suspicious of outside authority, there's this authoritarian strongman kind of, or at least seems like there is, which, I don't know, seems kind of contradictory. Maybe you can talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, the ethno-nationalism aspect helps a great deal. So, J.D. Vance has not ever been particularly consistent in his pronouncements. He's been a chameleon. Remember, he was a huge Trump critic before, and suddenly he's not as vice president. But what he's getting at that is consistent with the greater Appalachian cultural region that he and his family are from is an ethno-national idea, right? That whole blood and soil notion that Americans are a people, like shared genetic ties, and that therefore people who don't share those ties are not full Americans or, are on provisional status. That notion is very deep in Greater Appalachia. And the book actually talks about the development of the rival stories of who we are that came out of some of the regions. And the Greater Appalachian one was particularly fascinating because, remember the Appalachian people were discovered, in quotes, in around, 1880, 1900, 1910 by visitors from the outside who were like, oh my goodness, there are these people living in these hollows. And they, you can read their writings, they're very influential writings in, The Atlantic, which was an even bigger magazine then than now, and in books and stuff that said, these are people who, these Anglo-Saxon settlers who came back in the colonial period, our founders, but who got lost in these little eddies of history, trapped in valleys without enough resources and were forgotten there. And they're still speaking Elizabethan English, and they're still doing the old-time religion of our forefathers, and they're still holding the values, even using the technology of our Anglo-Saxon forefathers, was the argument. That here in amber is a crystallized, pure form of who we are supposed to be as Americans. Remember, this is all being said right in the middle of that great 1880 to 1924 immigration wave that brought, lots of people who weren't Anglo-Saxon Protestant into the country for the first time. Huge numbers of people from, who were Catholic and Orthodox Christian and from Eastern Europe and so on. And Protestant America was in the middle of a massive freak out about this, right? All Catholics were papists and they were going to just, follow orders from the Vatican. That went on until JFK was president. I mean, people were genuinely thought that the whole country was going to be destroyed. So, Protestant families were running around creating the Mayflower Society and the Colonial Dames and the Daughters of the American Revolution, which were genealogical projects to prove that you and your family were all part of the original true Americans. And then they go out there and they discover like these people who the whole argument was the value of these people is that they haven't been corrupted by all these outside influences. And all these foreign people have been coming in and technology and all that, but here are the true Americans. And that actually stuck. And as, became part of the Appalachian identity, the idea that we are the real Americans, that there's an American ethnicity and we are it, and that we haven't been corrupted by the outside. We're the pure version with the pure values. And you can even see it on census maps. Like, I remember the 2000 census, if you look at a county level, the dominant self-declared ethnicity in each county, there's this whole section that's analogous to my greater Appalachia, where the answer was American. Not English, not Scots-Irish, which probably was the accurate answer, not German, not Spanish or whatever, or Mexican like everywhere else, American, or sometimes even Native American in counties where there are no indigenous people. In other words, the idea that we aren't any of those things, that there's an indigenous American people, and the implications for that, if the country really belongs to you, then you can quickly find yourself to where J.D. Vance was on the stage at Claremont because, his people were part of that wave.
It's weird to me because when President Trump says something about how immigrants or some migrants are poisoning the blood of America, now I hear that and I go to East Germany and get kind of into freak out
Absolutely,
mode.
yeah.
But other people clearly don't, right? I mean, this resonates.
They may not be as familiar with the history of fascism and where it leads. No, I mean, everything that Trump has been saying for years is straight out of the fascist and authoritarian playbook on ethno-nationalism. The other, who bears sickness, who are vermin, who poison the blood, who are inherently bad people, that's all things that ethno-nationalists have said forever. And which, I got involved in this sort of, concern about authoritarianism because I, spent my 20s in Eastern Europe and the Balkans during the transition, collapse and transition from communism, ending with the Bosnian War. And there's places where this exact same arguments and stuff against people, these ethno-nationalist and ultimately fascist arguments were taking place. And it led to the siege of Sarajevo and tons of people being shot by their neighbors into ditches. And it's not somewhere you want to go. And that's sort of the language and playbook. The Department of Homeland Security has been posting on their official accounts, some of the classic iconography of American ethno-nationalism. John Gast's American Progress, a painting from the 1840s, which is considered like the ultimate symbol of manifest destiny thinking. It's a bunch of white settlers are crossing an allegorical plain to the west, and all the Indians are fleeing from their awesomeness and, disappearing off to the west side of the stage. And above the American settlers, leading them as this giant angel, literally carrying the Protestant Book of Common Prayer under her arm, like the Statue of Liberty's tablet, and stringing out. She has a coil of telegraph wire that she's stringing out that's forming along, right? And that DHS posts that as like something like an American heritage to be proud of, right? They're not hiding it. They're being very explicit. And it is not a place that any society wants to go, but especially one where, only a tiny proportion of us could declare majority definition of Americanness via that argument. It's, and why would you?
Yeah. There are these regional stories, I guess I'll call them, that we tell ourselves. Like, I was born and raised in Cleveland and
Western
Cleveland, Ohio,
Reserve.
and there you go, exactly. And I remember hearing the whole city on a hill thing from President Reagan. That really resonated with me. I had friends from the South who the Lost Cause thing resonated with them. And I guess I'm wondering, do you feel like we need these stories in some way that we really can't do without these kind of, cultural foundation stories, I guess?
That's an excellent question. I mean, when I was younger, more idealistic, I was like, we don't need this myth. It's myth making, right? It's sort of like a shared accepted propaganda about who we are and what we're supposed to be. And I was like, oh, we don't need this stuff. Humans can think it through rationally. No, we really do need this stuff. I mean, every nation, like a nation's an abstraction. I'm a United Statesian. I'm an American. I'm therefore tied more closely to some person I'll never meet 3,000 miles away from me than I am to, somebody in Canada. Why? This is right over the border from where I live in Maine and probably closer culturally. Those abstractions, nations don't really exist except in our minds. We can create institutions around them, but they're still an imagined community. And so you need a definition for any identity group. And we as individuals need identities. That's the part I missed when I was younger. That I've read a ton of this now in evolutionary biology and in child development, and how people develop cognitively. We are hardwired from way back, in our adaptations to the environment when we were being chased around to need to find a group, a band, and that band to be able to, work together and compete and survive, and who your identity is in that group is really important. We're pre-formatted to need to form this little social band identity and to consider our band better than the other bands out there of humans or whoever else. And that goes really deep. That's why we tell ourselves stories about who we are when we're young, when we're in middle school and we're trying to figure out who we are, and you try on different identities, and we have multiple identities at once. You're a Yankees fan, you're a Catholic, you're African-American, you're an economist. You have all these identities at the same time, but over the top, you may have a national identity. And you got to define it, because if there's a vacuum there, somebody is going to fill the vacuum. It cannot remain an empty space. If virtuous-minded people don't define it, then a demagogue and someone for selfish reasons will, and then you're in real trouble. So yeah, we need these stories, and we can't afford not to have them.
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard people suggest, well, yeah, these regional differences, maybe they exist, but they're not nearly as powerful as things like income and education. And so really, these may be more of a proxy for sure. The South has like these sort of attitudes, but that's really more explained by poverty and that sort of thing. And I know you get into, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that would be a logical thing for people to think, but no. I mean, when we look at the data, whatever project we're working on, and we're doing all data-related analysis, if we start trying to control for those things, like, okay, maybe it's poverty that is resulting in, the Deep South having, I can't remember, 2.5 times the per capita gun death rate of Yankeedom, or 9 times that of, like, I can't remember, 5 or 9 times that of the area around New York City, which is Dutch settled, even though that's the densest and most diverse part of the continent. Maybe that's just wealth and poverty. So we'll just take the richest counties in each region and compare them to each other. Or let's just take the poorest counties and compare them. Or, because the CDC data on gun violence sorted by race, let's just look at Black victims of gun violence. Let's just look at white victims. And on all of them, the gaps remained or even grew larger. Like, white on white gun homicides in the Deep South are many times higher than Yankeedom or New Netherland. I mean, many times higher. So, people say African Americans have a much higher gun death rate, gun homicide rate, which is true, and more African Americans live in the South. Therefore, no, if you just compare the rate for white people or rich counties, they're all play out. Same thing with life expectancy. I was stunned. There's a significant life expectancy differences between the regions. 3 to 5 year population level differences might not sound like a lot, but that's like the difference between the gap between the United States and like Bulgaria and the Philippines. It's a really big gap. But we looked at, okay, let's just look at, let's take the richest quarter of counties in the entire United States, and the ones that are those richest ones in the whole country that happen to be in Yankeedom, let's compare their life expectancy with the richest ones in the Deep South. And let's do it for the poorest. It was stunning. The richest counties in the entire United States, which happen to be in the Deep South, have a lower life expectancy than the poorest quartile of counties in the entire United States that happen to be in Yankeedom. I mean, FICO credit scores. If people look at Nationhood Lab, you'll find .org is the website. We took the FICO credit scores by region, enormous differences between them, and clear cut, like almost like just exactly to the map. Like if you map it with one color is good credit scores and one color is bad, like there's just one across the sort of northern regions. Every county almost is good, and in the southern regions, every county is bad, like without exception. Even though there are incredibly wealthy counties in the bad blob and incredibly poor ones in the good blob. There are some staggeringly poor, like Washington County in easternmost Maine, where I live, is often the poorest one in the entire Northeast, but FICO credit scores are actually relatively good. So yeah, you would think so, but when you really start probing the data, it turns out no. And that's what starts leading you to realize the power of culture. And in short, why? Because culture, the values of a culture have an enormous influence on who gets elected into power, and who gets elected into power creates the policy environment. And the policy environment creates all kinds of other things, including for health stuff and life expectancy, the social determinants of health, whether or not you've got medical care or you did as a baby, or schools and all that kind of stuff. And that has these knock-on effects.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Paramount Plus has movies. So many movies. The movies you've seen 1,000 times and could watch 1,000 more. Iconic movies your friends can't believe you haven't seen. New movies, classic movies, new takes on classic movies. So whether you're into Top Gun or The Naked Gun, Mean Girls or Mission Impossible, Smurfs or Sonic the Hedgehog, there's a mountain of movies to discover on Paramount Plus. Start streaming today.
Once upon a mundane morning, Barb's day got busy without warning. A realtor in need of an open house sign. No, 50 of them, and designed before 9.
My head hurts.
Any mighty tools to help with this plight? Aha! Barb made her move. She opened Canva and got in the groove.
Bulk creating Canva sheets. Create 50 signs fit for suburban streets.
Done in a click, all complete.
Sweet!
Now, imagine what your dreams can become when you put imagination to work at canva.com.
Yeah. And I guess, and this doesn't surprise me a whole lot, but one of the conclusions that I drew at least is that these sort of communitarian regions, communitarian cultures, do better in terms of almost all the things I would think we would care about, right? Life expectancy, quality of life, health, all these things. And yet, these individualistic cultures, when I talk to people from these cultures, they say, well, you don't understand the value of freedom. And maybe I don't. Maybe it's just going over my head or something. Or like when there are gun deaths and people from these cultures say, you know what? That's just the price you pay for the freedom to bear arms. And I just think, and maybe culturally, this is just, they're like talking past me culturally or something, because it's so hard for me to wrap my head around that.
Well, you are from the Western Reserve of Ohio, not from the, Virginia Military District, right?
Exactly,
down by Cincinnati. So, I mean, many people probably share that observation. And yeah, culture has enormous power, and the fundamental ideology, even if the data and everything shows that the individualistic position on this is wrong, people are going to dismiss it and push back because it has that kind of power. However, let's say you wanted to not have as many people die in, say, Greater Appalachia or anywhere from gun violence. You pick a policy. I ban extended gun magazines or close the loopholes in the gun registry, whatever it is. If you think that policy X will have some marginal but worthwhile, helpful benefits in that regard, the argument you might make in Greater Appalachia is if you do X, it will help you protect your family. Whereas in Yankeedom, if you do X, it will help make the community safer. Those are the ways to go in those two regions. And if you reverse those messages between those two regions, neither one would be as effective. So, I mean, there's useful information one can start having once you realize that this is what's going on, which is why diagnosing the problem and showing these differences and what's driving them is important. Maybe you do want to protect your family. It's well, that actually makes sense. You can counter that in lots of different ways. And then the broader thing, if the Greater Appalachian people and the Yankee people all agree in the promises in the Declaration, even as they interpret them differently, and you realize that, then you actually have some kind of framework for constructive discussion instead of just the Manichaean, good versus evil battle.
Yeah. And in a way, I wonder if it's actually good to have a certain amount of this tension, because as you've alluded to earlier, that both an extremist in communitarian and an extremist in individualistic cultures can lead to really bad results. Yeah. So having that sort of mix is probably better overall, I would think.
I mean, there's a reason that despite these fissures, the United States became, for a time, the most powerful country in the world, and one that many other countries sort of looked up to. The principles in the Declaration have kind of been adopted by great swaths of Western Europe and parts of East Asia. Those are the ideals that they have too. And that was not the case before the United States came along. There's something about that, it keeps us honest. Our balance point between the regions, we know that shifting over to the communitarian side fairly far has good results, farther than we are. What are the richest countries in the world? Or the ones with the highest happiness index, or the ones that the Libertarian Cato Institute considers to be the ideal, the most free market societies. A lot of them are the same countries in all those metrics, Denmark, Iceland, Sweden, Netherlands, Switzerland. And, that there's a reason for that. But if Yankeedom were on its own, Yankeedom might become a social democracy like those. You have a totally free and dynamic economy, but yet you tax it, right, to provide the infrastructure which you believe not only makes your citizens better off, but that makes the economy better off, right? You're building all the stuff and the regulatory forces to make sure no one's cheating and creating monopolies, and therefore it can be a win-win. So there is that balance, but how do you achieve it? And you can go,
and in those countries,
you can go totally wrong. I mean, like I said, I was a study abroad student in 1989 behind the Iron Curtain. It was communism and, Ceausescu's Romania. I mean, that was awful. You do not want to, deny individual liberty. There are dangers out there. It's just the United States is, we're way on the other side, so that's not our problem. But if you kept on going, beyond Denmark, things start falling apart. The individual ability to do things and to pursue your happiness starts being blocked and collapsing. So that's terrible too. But that's not the problem we have.
Yeah, no. Well, and I guess what makes it easier in a lot of ways is countries like Denmark are mostly one nation, where we're not. We're one country with a lot of those nations. And I also wonder then if maybe these things have really come to the fore a lot later than we might have expected, because early on we really were kind of like a federation of at least states, and so we kind of did our own thing. But then when the American experiment became sort of nationalized with the whole federal government taking such a role, all of a sudden now these sort of one-size-fit-all approaches were put on all of these different nations in the American country, and that's when people started to really push back. And I think too, you make a point in the book about the South and saying that really, if you think about it, the parts of the U.S. were essentially an authoritarian ethno-nationalist regime until really the 1960s or so. And so while the civil rights movement was like, wow, this is an awesome thing as far as I'm concerned from my background, it hit so much differently and still hits differently for a lot of people in the South, even up to, I would imagine, things like DEI and wokeness. You kind of trace a line directly from that. I mean, hell, even Tocqueville did it back when he was writing Democracy in America, way back in the day. So,
Yeah. And de Tocqueville was mostly in the Yankee frontier. Sort of like, he's blown away that he's running into people in some log cabin in the forest in the middle of nowhere who are like, reading the philosophers. That's because they're in the Yankee zone where there were taxpayer-financed public schools from the 1630s onward, and it had the highest literacy rate in the entire planet in the 17th century. He would not have found those people on the greater Appalachian deep southern frontier where there was no public education of any sort till after the Civil War. So, even he was kind of not realizing the differences in regions. But yes, the point you make is apt. And the Deep South in particular, I mentioned how the fundamental culture and the intellectual tradition was against the Declaration and the idea of us being that humans should be, have equal right to be free and all that kind of stuff. And that created an ethno-state. Remember, it's a race-based slave system followed by, after being smashed, a formal race-based caste system backed up by the law and death squads who'd go around and lynch and kill people to terrorize them. And that was the norm for, centuries, if you include the entire colonial period. And not until the 1960s did it start being confronted. And the legacy of that is, terrible. We don't like to talk about it or pretend that was that was an anomaly in the American tradition. It wasn't. And it has, there's been a battle. This is another my most recent book before Nations Apart is Union, which is the story of the struggle to define United States nationhood. It had to start in the 1830s. Well, what does it mean to be a United Statesian? Nobody knows. We won the American Revolution. Now it's a generation later. I know what it means to be a Connecticuter. I know what it means to be a South Carolinian. What's this American thing? There was a battle over it, and the battle was almost immediately between that ethno-nationalist and authoritarian form, slavery attached already, versus the Declaration's ideals. And it has been our eternal struggle. That was the struggle in the antebellum period, the Civil War, Reconstruction, the collapse of Reconstruction, the 1920s, 1910s, and 1980s, when we had an ethno-nationalist government. Woodrow Wilson, first Deep Southern president, he segregated the federal government, right? The victorious Union government segregated itself under Woodrow Wilson, passed the 1924 Immigration Act shortly after he was in office that literally imposed racial quotas and ethno-racial quotas to maintain the Anglo-Saxon character of the country, as they put it, where Birth of a Nation, the first blockbuster film, was all the rage, came out in 1913. That was a film literally celebrating the KKK's terrorist campaign to roll back the political emancipation of African Americans in the occupied Confederacy. That's the plot. The movie poster is, guys with their white hats on rearing horses. That was the official movie poster. It created the second Klan. So we were actually governed by ethno-nationalists for a time in the early part of the 20th century. And, that battle continued all the way through to the end of the 1960s when we finally, for the first time, became devoted to the Declaration at the federal level and across as a consensus across the country. But that tension that the federal government that was going to actually enforce the Constitution, right? The post-Civil War amendments, while the South was out and being occupied and they didn't have senators and congressmen, we passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which finally aligned our business plan for the country, the Constitution, with our mission statement, the Declaration. And the chafing, especially in the Deep South, against that and against the fact that you might have people try to enforce those laws, the equal protection of people, and that, everyone gets to vote and all that. The hangover's still with us. It was really, really with us in, the 60s and 70s especially, but you're seeing the same geographic divides and the same battles, and now it's, cloaked in DEI and all of that stuff, and ethno-nationalism of different sorts.
So to close things out, I want to think about how this works practically, because it seems like the way forward, if we are to have some sort of a national story, as you suggested, the Declaration of Independence seems like the fantastic place, maybe the only place to start. And so I guess I'm wondering, can new national stories be created sort of from the top down, or how does this work? Can it be an organic? I mean, how do you see this if you do see it? And obviously, we all hope it kind of comes to happen. How do you see the most likelihood path for this sort of thing evolving, some kind of national story that can be more powerful than our regional stories?
Yeah. And that, Union, that book I mentioned, I traced our creation of the national story and the battle through the people who actually somehow did it and advocated for it. And the answer is, the stories are, you got to be working with material that's out there on the ground and in people, but it actually takes somebody to articulate it. Top down doesn't mean the government articulated, but somebody articulated and started putting forward and being able to describe it in a way that other people are like, yeah, that's right. You're putting forward a story into the market, as it were, that people like, yeah, I'll buy that, right? So you got to be compelling. But we've stopped being able to talk about what our civic national story is. My argument is, after the Cold War, after I watched communism collapse in Eastern Europe, we just stopped talking about our values and all the stuff that we talked about a lot when we were fighting the Soviets. Suddenly it was just, it wasn't that liberal democracy or Western democracy had defeated state tyranny. It was capitalism defeats communism. Go capitalism. It'll all be globalization. We don't have to worry about nation states. They'll wither away. Look at the EU. It'll all be about the movement of goods and services in a deregulated financial environment. If you're from a part of the country where, you can't compete in the global economy, too bad, you should move, or, get a job at McDonald's. So that was being told by people, not just the United States, but in Britain and Europe and everywhere. Just, this will be good for you. And there's no moral content to it. I mean, yeah, we all care about our material prosperity. It's really important, but that's not a national story. That's just a, economic, plan. And so into that vacuum with rudderless, we and many other countries opened ourselves up to demagoguery, especially when, that go capitalism, deregulate everything, change the tax code so the wealthy don't pay any taxes and stuff, started creating these massive divides where, where you're born and what town you're born in pretty much determines your chances of getting anywhere. Like being born in Cleveland is now against you. I'm not talking about you were born in, Rwanda, right? It's like, you're not born in the 7 metroplexes where all the jobs are. Too bad. You're a Midlander in England or in, Scotland. Well, move to London or, go away. Yeah. So that was not a good way of doing things. And you have to have a compelling national story, and it has to be created by somebody. And I would finally say that that's what we did at Nationhood Lab with all that polling and tested. We were like, let's articulate something that people respond to that translates the values in the Declaration to a story about what's the purpose of the United States, who belongs, where did we come from, what's the meaning of our past, and where are we going? And it's one page.
Yeah.
Communications experts call it a core narrative frame. It's all available again at nationhoodlab.org. There's a 10-page report with the core narrative frame in there that gives people sort of something to riff off. And that's, somebody needs to do it.
Yeah.
So we were trying to put it out there since nobody seemed to be figuring out how do you talk about this stuff now. And it's really important.
Yeah, I think it's such important work. We'll make sure to put that link in the show notes as well. But again, the book is Nations Apart. It's fascinating. Really, you can't go wrong reading any book from Colin Woodard as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you.
But Nations Apart, excellent book. And it has just been such a pleasure talking with you today.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you have a question or comment for us, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. If you're not already a supporter of the show, we hope you'll consider becoming one. Supporters get ad-free versions of everything we release, our full-length midweek episode instead of just a preview, and access to our Politics Guys Discord group. It's a fun place with a great bunch of people. You can support us on Patreon, where you can even sign up for a free trial. And if Patreon isn't your thing, or you're a current supporter and want to give us a little extra one-shot contribution, you can support us on PayPal and Venmo too. You'll find links to all our support options at politicsguys.com/support and in the show notes. If you'd like to get our full-length midweek episodes, but you're not in a position to financially support the podcast right now, just email me. I'm at mike@politicsguys.com, and I will be happy to get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, we'd appreciate it if you could subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our wonderful executive producers. They are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, and Jody Marie Miller.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,